At 6:30 a.m. on the morning of the 18th of April 1956, a milkman named Patrick Rigney made a shocking discovery on the steps leading to the basement of a Georgian townhouse on Dublin's Hume Street. Before him lay the body of 33-year-old Helen O'Reilly, her legs bound together and a silk stocking tied tightly around her neck. As Rigney tried to make sense of what he was seeing, he was startled by a noise that seemed to emanate from the basement below. Fearfully, he peered over the wrought iron railings, where he saw a woman pressing her back up against the wall and staring back up at him. Rigney left the scene in search of a Garda, and the blonde-haired woman climbed back up the steps as quickly as her arthritic knees would allow and fled to her cramped and cluttered flat 2 doors down the street. How could this have happened again, she thought. It was only 5 years since she had dumped Bridget's body on Hume Street, and those poxy detectives had nearly collared her for murder. Mamie Cadden paced up and down in her flat as she frantically concocted a story to tell the guards who were bound to come knocking on her door. It was hardly her fault that those pregnant women had died, she thought. Sure, they had sought the famous nurse Cadden out for themselves. She was only providing a service the women desperately wanted, but which the law strictly forbade. She gathered up her medical equipment and hid it as best she could in a small space and braced herself for what was to come. When Patrick Rigney discovered the body of Helen O'Reilly on Hume Street, he exposed an underworld of backstreet medical practitioners that many people knew about, but in a deeply conservative 1950s Ireland were practically forbidden from discussing. It set in motion a police investigation and a dramatic trial that would find Mamie Cadden guilty of murder and see her sentenced to death. From her birth in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to her childhood in Mayo, and her glory days at her prestigious nursing home in Rathmines, where she excelled as an independent businesswoman, in a repressive 1930s Dublin, her multiple convictions and prison terms, and her death sentence in a Dublin courtroom. This is the story of one of the most notorious women in Irish history, and also the lives of the 2 women whose bodies were discarded on a Dublin street. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. These videos take weeks to research, write, film on location, narrate, and edit. Your likes, comments, and shares enable the video to reach a wider audience, and it will help me to continue on my mission to bring back to life the lesser known stories and characters from Ireland's long history. You can also find the Obscure Ireland with Peter podcast on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. To begin the story of Mary Anne Cadden, we first need to travel a long way from Dublin's Hume Street, a journey of no less than 5,000 kilometres, to the booming industrial city of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where 2 Irish emigrants, each in search of a better life, fell in love in the early 1890s. Although Patrick Cadden and Mary McLaughlin both hailed from County Mayo, their first encounter took place in the bustling mining city, and there the couple married in 1891. Patrick, like many thousands of Irishmen before him, had immediately set to work in the coal mines on his arrival in Scranton. The job was dangerous and dirty, but it provided him with a wage steady enough to start a family. On the 27th of October 1891, Patrick and Mary were blessed with their first child, a fair-haired girl who they named Mary Ann. They would eventually have 6 more children, although only 5 would survive the dangers of childhood at the turn of the century. Although work was abundant in Scranton, life could also be difficult there. As a centre of industry, the air was often thick with smoke. Houses were overshadowed by vast mounds of discarded coal dust, and the gruelling work in the mines below soon grew tiresome for Patrick. In 1895, news of the death of Patrick's father reached the Caddens, and the couple decided to move their young family back to Mayo to live on the farm Patrick inherited in the townland of Doonbreda, a short distance from Laherdon. Their eldest child, Mary Ann, was now 4 years old and had already earned the pet name that would follow her for the rest of her life. Mamie was soon enrolled in Lahardane National School, where her siblings would follow, and she would stay until the age of 15. The industrious family opened a grocer's at the farm to supplement their income, and the 1901 census shows that they were comfortable enough to employ a servant, 16-year-old Katie Donahue. When Mamie came of age, the task of running the shop fell largely to her. She was a hard-working, capable and ambitious young woman who, although greatly respected by her family, dreamt of a life that rural Mayo could not offer her. Despite being the eldest child of the Cadden family, she knew that as a woman, the farm would eventually be left to her younger brother Joe. She held on tight to fading childhood memories of the busy streets of Scranton and set her sights on a new life in Dublin. Mamie often admired the local midwife, who held a position of respect in the community, someone who people turned to in a time of need, and who seemed to have a degree of freedom that the traditional role of housewife did not offer. She thought to herself that this job could provide her with the lifestyle she dreamt of. However, there was one obstacle to overcome. Mamie would need a significant amount of money to travel to Dublin, find lodgings, and spend 6 months training in the National Maternity Hospital in Hume Street to qualify as a midwife. The farm that the Cadden family operated in Mayo did not actually belong to them. Patrick had inherited the right to be a tenant and had merely taken over the rental agreement, a position occupied by hundreds of thousands of farmers across Ireland. Patrick had been saving his money carefully, however, and in 1911 he was able to purchase his farm from his landlord under the terms of the Land Commission. He also set aside a portion of the land and put it in the name of Mary Anne Cadden, his beloved first daughter. Patrick supported his daughter's ambitions of becoming a midwife, and in 1925 purchased her plot of land, giving Mamie the funds she needed to travel to Dublin. In 1925, Mary Anne Cadden left her home in rural Mayo and embarked on a journey that was to drastically change her life. She completed her training in Hume Street and was duly added to the register of midwives. We can find 28-year-old Mamie on the 1926 census, where she is living as a visitor in the home of Charles Byrne, a licensed driver, and his wife Mary, who is also a midwife. Her occupation is given as a nurse in training at Hume Street Hospital. The house must have been rather cramped, as the single-storey over-basement home was occupied by a total of 10 people. There is also a curious entry for the Byrne's 18-year-old son Christopher, who was formerly a soldier in the National Army but has been out of work for 2 years. The enumerator has added the words, "God help him," beneath his occupation. What happened to Christopher to elicit this strange response from the enumerator? Mamie did not waste any time once she was qualified, and quickly found herself a job at the Alverno nursing home on Portland Row, a short distance from her digs. About this time, she also changed the spelling of her surname from C-A-D-E-N to C-A-D-D-E-N, the way it had been spelt when the family had lived in Scranton. Mamie was a highly motivated person, and after just 2 years of working on Portland Row, she had saved enough money to leave and rent a house in Ranelagh, where she opened her own maternity nursing home on Beechwood Avenue at the end of 1928. The nursing home, which she named St. Melrunes, was a place where pregnant women could stay to give birth under Mamie's expert supervision, in a time before attending hospital became the norm. Throughout her career, Mamie would use brief and carefully worded newspaper notices to advertise her business. In addition to maternity care, she also offered treatment for people who suffered with their nerves and more mundane problems such as dandruff and constipation. At this time, she also adopted the name Nurse Cadden, a name that would become renowned and ultimately notorious in Dublin over the next 2 decades. Business boomed in St. Melrunes, and as Nurse Cadden's reputation grew, she decided that the house on Beechwood Avenue was too small for her needs. She looked enviously at the tall townhouses in nearby Rathmines, and in July 1931 she took out a mortgage and purchased number 4 Ormond Terrace. This was a remarkable achievement for a single woman in her early 30s who only 6 years earlier was running a farm shop in Mayo and was now the proud owner of a 3-storey over-basement townhouse within a stone's throw of Dublin city centre. Her business grew in leaps and bounds, and she soon had a staff of nurses working for her, including one Molly O'Grady. Mamie had developed a taste for the finer things in life, and when not working, could often be found socialising in exclusive hotels and restaurants around the city, such as the Shelburne Hotel on St. Stephen's Green. She dressed stylishly in long fur coats, and her fair hair, now dyed blonde, set her apart from the crowd in a deeply conservative and religious 1930s Dublin. In 1934, Mamie purchased a bright red convertible MG sports car, which she drove around the city streets, top down, blonde hair blowing in the wind, and was instantly recognisable in a city that had a small fraction of the cars that clog its arteries today. In an oppressive time for women who were barred from working once they got married, and as the power of the Catholic Church and its influence on government policy grew, Mamie represented everything the church and state feared. She was an independently successful woman who had no interest in marriage or religion, and certainly had no desire to start a family. Imagine stepping out of Mass on Sunday morning in 1930s Dublin to be greeted by the sight and sound of Mamie Cadden cruising by in her MG. Much to her amusement, she raised many an authoritative and clerical eyebrow. In addition to maternity care, Mamie also offered other services in her Rathmines nursing home to both men and women, from treating dandruff to soothing frayed nerves, and even, as this advert claims, surgical care. Exactly how effective these treatments were is highly questionable. Although a qualified midwife, Mamie was certainly not a doctor or a surgeon. However, her unshakable confidence and authority did seem to garner trust, and people suffering from embarrassing illnesses may have preferred the privacy she offered over a visit to a local GP. She also provided a private fostering and adoption service, and for a sum of £50, she would arrange for an unwanted baby to be cared for by a foster mother and eventually placed with a new family. This was a surprisingly common practice at the time, and being unregulated, was frequently abused. Some unscrupulous operators would take the initial fee and then abandon the child at the side of the road or on the steps of a church, so it would become somebody else's responsibility. Nurse Cadden had also developed a reputation as somebody who you could turn to if you found yourself experiencing a crisis pregnancy. Abortion was completely illegal in Ireland, and many women, fearing the dire social and financial consequences of having a child outside of marriage, looked to private practitioners such as Nurse Cadden for help. A ban of contraception, a regime of strict censorship, a lack of education, and a fear of institutions such as the Magdalen laundries that incarcerated and persecuted those who were deemed by the church to be fallen women, created a market for clinics that offered backstreet abortions, known at the time as illegal operations. Nurse Cadden, being first and foremost a business person, saw an opportunity to make money, and her nursing home in Rathmines soon became even busier as word quietly spread through the city of the service she was willing to provide. Cadden was certainly not the only person to offer illegal operations in the city. In a grand house on Dublin's Merrion Square, William Henry Coleman ran a clinic that offered similar illegal operations, and was somebody Mamie would come to view as a rival. Unlike Mamie, however, who at least was a qualified midwife, Coleman had absolutely no medical training, and was in fact an electrician and an ex-convict. Across the River Liffey on Parkgate Street was one of the busiest clinics in the country that was operated by Mary Maloney. As the practice was illegal Mamie risked prosecution and imprisonment should proof of her work be discovered. Yet despite this, the existence of her practice and others became an open secret in the city. Mamie was highly intelligent and extremely careful. Her nursing home was professionally operated, and her intentionally vague adverts left little for increasingly suspicious authorities to work with. Yet she was soon to find herself in serious trouble with the Gardaí. One evening in May, during the summer of 1938, as a local man named James Stoney walked along a quiet stretch of road in Rosetown, just outside Dunshaughlin in County Meath, he heard what sounded like the faint cry of an infant. He followed the cries around the corner to where he discovered a 6-week-old baby girl, apparently dumped by the side of the road. Shocked by this strange sight, he went to seek help from his neighbour, and soon the unidentified baby girl was taken into care by the family of local Garda Robert Goff. An investigation was launched to try and discover the identity of the abandoned child, and as Gardaí interviewed witnesses who had been out walking in the area, they found that almost all of them reported the unusual sight of a red MG being driven on the quiet road by a woman with bright blonde hair, while another woman sat in the passenger seat. Needless to say, there were not many red MGs registered to female owners in 1930s Ireland, and Mamie Cadden soon found herself at the centre of a controversy that was to permanently damage her professional and personal reputation and bring a dramatic end to her flashy lifestyle. A few days later, Gardaí arrived at the door of St. Mary's in Rathmines, where they inspected the home's birth register and found that 6 girls had been born in the home in early March. However, one of them had not been registered with the chief medical officer. Mamie admitted to being in Dunshaughlin on the evening in question, but denied having any involvement in the abandonment. She claimed to have travelled through Dunshaughlin on her way to Navan to meet a boy whom she did not wish to name, in case an association with her caused him embarrassment. Gardaí suspected that the woman in the passenger seat of the car was her assistant, Molly O'Grady, but Mamie confidently asserted that Molly had not been with her. Mamie had little respect for the Gardaí and deeply resented their line of questioning, and the following evening she took the strange step of returning to Dunshaughlin once more, where she drove around the town and the road the child was abandoned on, and was once again spotted by locals, who this time took note of her registration number, KG 1647. Garda Robert Goff was on duty that evening, and when he heard the car approaching, he signalled to the driver to stop. There was Mamie Cadden in the driver's seat, and beside her in the passenger seat was Molly O'Grady. He asked her what her business was in the town that evening, to which Mamie quipped,
"Do you think I dumped another one this evening?"
She burst into laughter and drove off in the direction of Dublin. Gardaí returned to St. Mary's several times over the following weeks to further question Mamie, who was now becoming openly hostile to their presence. They seized her register, which now appeared to have some pages missing, and questioned Molly O'Grady, who, when detectives had first called to the door, had given them a false name. On one occasion, as the detectives questioned Mamie about the births in the home, she shouted at them that
"The only bastards born in this house were fathered by guards."
In July 1938, Gardaí returned once more to Rathmines Road, and this time placed Anne Cadden and Molly O'Grady under arrest for conspiring to abandon an infant girl in Meath. Mamie always denied that Molly O'Grady had been in the car with her on the evening the child was abandoned, but the fact she had brought her with her on her return to Dunshaughlin incriminated her. The fact that nobody had actually seen Mamie leave the child at the side of the road was a problem for the prosecution, but the evidence gathered by Gardaí at the home, the statements of witnesses who had clearly seen her driving in the area, and Mamie's lies and hostile attitude convinced the court that she was the guilty party. Gardaí had discovered letters in the home that discussed the fee of £50 that Mamie was charging to take in unwanted babies and find them a new home. It appeared to the court that she was operating a scam where she would pocket the fee and simply dump the child on the roadside, where it would become somebody else's responsibility. Mamie Cadden, who had dyed her hair black in the days before the trial in an attempt to appear more humble, was found guilty and was sentenced to 12 months hard labour in Mountjoy prison for a crime the trial judge, Mr. Justice Black, described as one of callous selfishness and frigid calculation. Molly O'Grady was also found guilty, but her sentence was suspended, as she had clearly been acting under the influence of Mamie. It seemed that everything Mamie Cadden had worked for was lost. Her reputation was in tatters. She faced 12 long months of hard labour. Her beloved nursing home in Rathmines was sold to pay her legal expenses, and she had caused great embarrassment to the Cadden family, who had been so proud of her achievements. Yet there was more humiliation to come, as rumours of what took place in Rathmines spread like wildfire. During the trial, Gardaí had conducted an extensive search of St. Mayo ruins that included excavating the gardens, where they found the remains of a premature infant, and by using the home's register were able to track down the child's mother, who admitted to seeking Mamie's help after suffering a hemorrhage, and ultimately the girl had been stillborn. While Mamie did not face prosecution for this discovery, a myth built up around her and the home, as false stories of dozens of bodies being discovered in a Rathmines garden made her the most notorious woman in Ireland. She was, however, removed from the register of midwives and was forbidden from being in the presence of any woman while she gave birth. Mamie served her time in Mountjoy, and on her release, she used the little money she had left to rent a basement unit at 21 Pembroke Street Upper. She had been publicly humiliated, her right to work as a midwife removed, and had lost her beloved nursing home, all as a result of what she viewed as a witch hunt conducted by the Gardaí, who she now utterly despised. But none of this was going to stop Mamie Cadden from earning a living, and from her new home on Pembroke Street, she continued on with her practice of providing care for general ailments, and also the illegal operations that were likely from this point her main source of income. Mamie was infuriated by what had happened to her, and she had in her possession a streak of some vindictiveness. Her money had all been spent on her defence, and she deeply resented the fact that her solicitor had failed to keep her out of prison. So, in 1941, she decided to sue Charles Boyle of Middle Abbey Street, her own solicitor, for a sum of £106. Mamie complained to the court that Boyle had advised her to dye her blonde hair black before the trial, in an attempt to appear more humble to the jury, and that the dye she used had caused her hair to fall out, had given her severe headaches, and had made her take to her bed while imprisoned in Mountjoy. She also claimed that Boyle had held onto her register from St. Mayo ruins, which she badly needed as it contained contact details for former clients. Mamie represented herself as she had no money to pay a new solicitor. The judge did not believe her claims regarding the hair dye, as she provided no proof of the damage that had been caused, and Charles Boyle showed the court that it was in fact Mamie Cadden who owed him a sum of £179 that she was unable to pay. Mamie was awarded just £2 for her ill-advised claim, but she did manage to have her precious register returned. It would not be long before Mamie found herself in trouble with the law again, as in 1944, a procedure she performed on a young domestic servant in her Pembroke Street clinic caused the 20-year-old to be admitted to hospital with acute peritonitis. Once again, Mamie Cadden was placed under arrest, and in a trial from which the public and press were excluded, she was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude in Mountjoy, a devastating blow when it seemed like she was getting her life back on track. During the trial, her vindictiveness reared its head again when she revealed to the court that the young woman had attended her clinic before for treatment of symptoms that implied she had contracted a venereal disease, causing the young woman great embarrassment. The authorities were cracking down on the booming business of illegal operations and wished to make an example of those that were profiting from the backroom practice. The Second World War had made travel to England far more difficult, and women who would otherwise have chosen to take a ferry and obtain an illegal operation in more anonymous surroundings were forced to consider the services of Mamie Cadden and her competitors. The following year, Henry Coleman of Merrion Square was sentenced to 15 years penal servitude, and in 1946, Mary Maloney of Parkgate Street and her partner Christopher Williams were imprisoned for 10 and 7 years for carrying out illegal operations. On her release from prison, Mamie Cadden was a very different person to the confident and successful young woman who had driven her sports car around the city. It was now 1950 and she was about to turn 60 years of age. She was suffering from arthritis and her eyesight was deteriorating, yet her spirit had not been broken by a further 5 years of penal servitude. Once again she found herself a new home, this time a small flat in a shabby townhouse at 17 Hume Street, within view of St. Stephen's Green, and once again she continued where she had left off 5 years earlier. Mamie's flat on the first floor at the rear of the building was cramped and cluttered, a far cry from her glory days in Rathmines. Long gone were the staff and bedrooms of St. Mailrooms, and the possessions she had managed to keep lay strewn across the flat that lacked running water. 2 shelves above her bed held her precious telephone and radio, while a sign pinned to the wall warned anyone who might visit the flat against asking for credit. Mamie was not a charitable figure, and she demanded payment up front, failing which you would be turned away no matter what your situation. However small her surroundings were, they were large enough, she believed, to allow her to continue her work, and at times her own bed became her operating theatre. Nurse Cadden was back in business. As Mamie re-established her practice on Hume Street, 2 young women went about their business, unaware that within a few short years, both of their bodies would be found by members of the public, apparently discarded on the Georgian paving stones of Hume Street. In 1951, 30-year-old Bridget Breeson was living with her sister Mary in number 6 B block of Buckingham Buildings on Buckingham Street on the north side of Dublin City. Bridget was a dancer with the O.D. O'Donovan troupe and had recently returned to Dublin following a tour that included performances in Limerick, Cork and Belfast, and had already purchased her ticket for the next leg of the tour that was due to begin in Liverpool on the 9th of June. Bridget had a secret, however, that she was keeping from her friends and family. She had been having an affair, likely with a wealthy and married man named Standish O'Grady from Fermoy, and was now pregnant. Bridget, a working-class professional dancer, could simply not afford to have a baby on her own, and as the father was a married man, there was no chance of him leaving his wife for her. On the evening of Friday, the 8th of June, 1951, Kevin O'Neill of 15 Lower Rutland Street called to his cousin's flat on Buckingham Street. Kevin knew that Bridget would be leaving the next day, and he invited her out for ice cream before her departure. The cousins travelled to a cafe on O'Connell Street where they had their ice cream together. Kevin then walked her to the bus stop where she informed him that she had an appointment with somebody, and she boarded the number 11 bus heading southbound. Bridget was next seen by her friend and fellow dancer Una Quinn on Grafton Street at about 9:45 p.m. She told Una that she had a date with a man. Her date that night was likely Standish O'Grady, who had made an appointment with Mamie Cadden and had already paid her a fee of £20, a sum of money Bridget likely did not have. Bridget climbed the stairs of 17 Hume Street to Mamie's flat, where a procedure involving a syringe filled with water and Jay's fluid was carried out that went catastrophically wrong. Mamie had failed to ensure that the syringe was properly purged, and air was introduced to Bridget's body that within a few moments sent her into shock and heart failure. 33-year-old Bridget Breeson lay dead in the flat of Mamie Cadden. As Mamie stood still and looked at the body on her bed, she contemplated her next move. This was not her fault, she thought. It was an accident. After all, Bridget had come to her for assistance, and she was just doing her job. She was certainly not going back to Mountjoy on her behalf. Sometime in the early hours of the 9th of June, Mamie, possibly assisted by O'Grady, dragged Bridget Breeson back down the stairs she had climbed a few hours earlier and dumped her body a short distance away on Hume Street. At about 4 a.m, a lamplighter named George Brady of Riverside Cottages in Temple Oak walked along Hume Street as he made his morning rounds. He noticed nothing unusual at that time, but just 30 minutes later, Greta Garvey, who had been working all night in a ladder repair business at 21 Eli Place, let her dog out for a run before she went to bed. Her dog ran around the corner onto Hume Street, but did not return to her when she called. She went out to see what was keeping him, and as she walked up Hume Street, she noticed the dog trembling next to an object on the ground. Not sure what to make of this scene, she called out to a young man named Francis O'Neill, who was returning home to his flat in 17 Hume Street, the building he shared with Mamie Cadden. He approached the object and, to his horror, realised it was the dead body of a woman. Francis walked Greta Harvey back to 21 Ely Place, from where he dialed 999. Suspicion immediately fell on Mamie Cadden, as Gardaí were well aware that she was practising again on Hume Street, but they had no evidence to connect her to Bridget Breeson, despite the fact that the inquest confirmed that she had likely died as a result of a failed illegal operation. This had been an uncomfortably close call for Mamie, and despite the unwanted attention it had brought to her door, and the fact that her negligence was likely the cause of Bridget's death, she showed no sign of remorse, and was determined to continue, regardless of the danger her treatments posed to the women who put their trust in her. On the 30th of November 1946, the marriage of Helen Phelan and John Francis O'Reilly took place in St Andrew's Church on Westland Row. Helen, then in her mid-20s, came from a humble farming background in Kilkenny, and so far had led a fairly sheltered life. Her father Thomas was a farm labourer, and the family lived in Tinnalinton near the town of Ballyragget. Her birth name may actually have been Ellen, after her mother, but she was known for most of her life as Helen. Her new husband John was almost 10 years older than her, and had already lived a most dramatic life. John Francis O'Reilly, born in Clare in 1916, was the son of an RIC man named Bernard, who had taken part in the arrest of Roger Casement. In his early life, O'Reilly worked as a civil servant before he resigned and travelled to Buckfast Abbey in England to become a monk. His religious vocation lasted only a few weeks, following which he worked a multitude of jobs across England before moving to the island of Jersey in 1940. With the Second World War raging, the British authorities organised an evacuation of Jersey, as it became apparent that it would soon be occupied by the Nazis. O'Reilly, who had no intention of being conscripted into the British Army, decided to stay in Jersey, where he enthusiastically collaborated with the Nazi regime and secured himself a series of jobs. O'Reilly eventually moved to Germany, where he worked as a radio broadcaster for the Ministry of Propaganda, and then received training to operate as a spy. In 1943, O'Reilly parachuted into Ireland from a Luftwaffe bomber, carrying with him a radio transmitter to communicate his findings to the SS. Within 24 hours of his landing, he was arrested by Gardaí and was imprisoned in Arbour Hill. He briefly escaped from custody, but was recaptured in Kilkee, and his own father claimed the £500 reward money. O'Reilly was released at the end of the war and married Helen a year later. Unfortunately for Helen, he was about as good a husband as he was a spy. The couple had 6 children together before John decided to move to Nigeria to work for a tin mining company and abandoned his wife and children to their own devices. Helen, then living on the Enniskerry Road in Wicklow, found herself in an impossible position. She was completely isolated, with 6 children to care for and no income. She needed money, yet there was no way for her to work and look after the children at the same time, and she was forced to place them into the care of various convents around the city. Helen then moved to England in the hopes of finding work, but frequently returned to Dublin to visit her children, and hoped that one day she would be able to take them out of the care of the nuns. Helen's married life in Ireland had been one of social isolation, and as a naturally outgoing and gregarious person, her new life at least allowed her to socialise more freely. She often met with friends in bars and clubs in both Preston and on her return to Dublin, and had a few romantic relationships with men. And early in 1956, Helen realised to her horror that she was pregnant. Although abandoned by her husband, she was still married to a man that could reappear in her life unannounced at any given moment. The father of the child was certainly not going to offer her support, and she was in no financial position to have another baby. Helen surely must have feared what the nuns would think of her situation, and that she would lose what little chance she had of being reunited with her children. And on a return visit to Dublin in April, she sought the assistance of a well-known nurse, whom she knew was now living at number 17 Hume Street. Five years after the death of Bridget Breeson, Mamie Cadden was still busy performing illegal operations in her cramped flat on Hume Street. She was now 65 years of age, and her arthritis had worsened significantly, causing her to walk with a limp, while her eyesight slowly deteriorated. While Helen may have read about the discovery of Bridget Breeson's body in the newspaper 5 years previously, there was no way for her to know that she had died while being operated on by Nurse Cadden, and that soon she would meet an almost identical fate. On her return to Dublin, Helen stayed with a friend named Thomas Crowe in a flat in 21 Ely Place, before finding alternative accommodation in a boarding house on Buckingham Street, not far from where Bridget Breeson had lived. On Tuesday, the 17th of April, Helen, well dressed and wearing her favourite black coat, spent much of the day visiting pubs around the city, sometimes in the company of one of her friends. But at the forefront of her mind was the appointment she had made with Nurse Cadden for later that evening. At some point in the afternoon, she visited her bank, where she withdrew a sum of £15. Mamie was now being extremely careful, as she knew she was under guard of scrutiny and only accepted clients by prior appointment, and when she did so, wrote only a brief description of their appearance in her diary rather than their name. In Helen's case, she simply wrote 8 p.m, black coat. In addition to her health problems, Mamie was also under threat of eviction at the time Helen made her appointment. She was fighting with her landlord, Lawrence Brophy, who, likely in an attempt to get rid of his notorious tenant, had informed Mamie that he was raising her rent to a price she could not afford. Mamie had always had a temper, and could be particularly hostile when dealing with figures of authority such as the Gardaí, who she took great pleasure in verbally abusing. But the stress of the last few years was taking its toll on her mental health, and in a letter written to authorities to complain about the rise in her rent, she threatened to kill her landlord, Lawrence Brophy.
If he comes in here to put me out, I will shoot him dead, and also put the butcher knife to the handle in his pot belly.
As Helen walked up the first flight of stairs in number 17, she was completely oblivious to the strain her nurse was under, and believed, or rather hoped, that her predicament would be over within a few short minutes. At 6:20 a.m. the following morning, a milkman named Patrick Rigney was making his way through the city with his assistant, Anthony Kiernan. As he drove his float along St. Stephen's Green, he glanced down Hume Street, where he saw a woman crouching over what appeared to be a pile of clothes on the ground, about halfway down the street. Rigney continued on his route that a few minutes later would bring him back to Hume Street, where Kiernan delivered milk to several houses, while Rigney, curious as to what he had seen earlier, walked towards number 15 to inspect the pile of clothing. As he drew closer, Rigney slowed to a crawl, and the blood drained from his face. Before him was no bundle of clothes, but rather the dead body of Helen O'Reilly, covered partially by her black coat. Rigney could see that Helen's legs, which lay partially over the steps leading to the basement, were tied together with fabric, while the rest of her body lay on the footpath. Around her neck was tied a scarf and one of her own silk stockings. Rigney was startled by a noise that seemed to emanate from the basement below, and he fearfully peered over the wrought iron railings, where he saw a woman pressing herself up against the wall and looking back up at him. Blonde hair and spectacles, he noted to himself, before he returned to his milk float and drove in the direction of Bagot Street to alert the Gardaí of the body in Hume Street. As Gardaí arrived on the scene, Mamie paced up and down in her flat. She couldn't believe this had happened to her again, and she knew it was only a matter of time before there was a forceful knock on her door. She frantically went over in her mind what she was going to say. She knew what to do. She had been in bed all night with her radio on to help her sleep. There was no way she could have heard anything. Surely a man must have done this to the poor creature. Why else would they have tied her stockings around her neck? She had never laid eyes on her before. She certainly had not performed an illegal operation in her flat, failed to purge her syringe of air, watched as the unknown woman convulsed, lost consciousness in a matter of seconds, died within minutes, and then dragged her body down the stairs so she could dump her outside number 15 like a bag of refuse. Hume Street was soon teeming with excited detectives, and as the news of the discovery spread, crowds of people began to gather at either end of the street. All of them knew that Mamie Cadden was responsible. For the public, the virulent rumours of a mass grave in Rathmines and an imaginary story of Bridget Breeson bleeding to death on Hume Street as she made a desperate attempt to return to Nurse Cadden for help were enough to convict her, but the Gardaí needed to find solid proof. A detailed and forensic investigation of the scene followed in an attempt to connect Helen O'Reilly to Mamie Cadden. The dirty pavement had been swept clean as the body was dragged along the street, and Gardaí were able to follow the trail which led them in the direction of number 17. On the steps leading down to the basement lay a parcel and a handbag. The parcel contained the victim's shoes, while the handbag contained documents that identified the victim as 33-year-old Helen O'Reilly. Photographers took detailed photographs of the scene, and minute fibres on Helen's jacket were examined. Despite the stockings and scarf being tied around her neck, there appeared to be no bruising, suggesting that strangulation was not the cause of death. A nurse was called for from the hospital across the road to look at the body. She attempted to lift the victim's arm, but found she was unable to do so as the body was stiff. She clearly had been dead for some time. The state pathologist, Dr. Morris Hickey, arrived at 8:20 a.m. to begin his examinations. The body was then removed to the city morgue for post-mortem, where Dr. Hickey found clear signs that the victim had died from an air embolism that had been caused by an illegal operation. The cause of death was identical to that of Bridget Breeson 5 years earlier. While performing the post-mortem, he also noticed that a smell of disinfectant emanated from the body. Gardaí took their time with the investigation, and it was a few hours before they knocked on the front door of number 17 Hume Street. Mamie was standing in the hall and had already peeked her head out the door a few times. She answered the door in her dressing gown. Detectives told her about the discovery of a body a few doors down, and Mamie exclaimed,
"Isn't it terrible? Sure, it must have been a man who did that. Poor bitch."
When asked if she had heard anything during the night, she responded,
"Sure, I could hear no noise. My room was away at the back, and as well as that, I had the radio on all night."
Each resident of number 17 was interviewed, and Mrs. Farrelly, who lived on the same floor as Mamie, told Gardaí that she had been awoken early that morning by a sound she described as being like dragging or pushing something, like moving furniture. The sounds went on for some time, but stopped briefly when Mr. Moran came down the stairs at his usual time of 5:45 a.m. to leave for work, and had resumed immediately after. When Mr. Moran went out the front door, he paused on the steps for a moment and lit a cigarette. He looked up and down the street, but noticed nothing unusual, and proceeded on his way to work. Mamie had told Gardaí that she was listening to the radio all night, as she had difficulty sleeping due to her arthritis, but Mrs. Farrelly informed detectives that Mamie had told her that she had been fast asleep all night. Mamie allowed the detectives into her flat, where they noticed a distinct smell of disinfectant coming from a bucket in the middle of the room. At this point, they did not have any solid evidence to connect Mamie to Helen, and did not have a search warrant, so they took the opportunity to make a mental note of everything they saw in the cluttered flat. Nobody had seen Helen enter the house on Hume Street, nor had they seen the two women together, so for now the case was circumstantial. 10 days later, Gardaí returned to 17 Hume Street, this time armed with a search warrant. Hairs had been found on Helen's coat that looked like they may have come from a fur coat, while fibres, possibly from a carpet or a rug, had been found on her shoes. Mamie was famous for her stylish clothing, and in particular her extravagant fur coats. They entered the flat as Mamie, who by this point was beginning to feel cornered, hurled abuse at them. In the flat, they found a selection of medical equipment, including syringes, tubing, forceps, and a speculum. Mamie explained the forceps and speculum away as souvenirs from her days in Rathmines. The syringe and tubing, she explained, was used to administer enemas, one of her most popular treatments. She denied that she had any involvement with these so-called illegal operations that the Gardaí were so determined to convict her of. Mamie's diary was seized, and when Gardaí checked the entry for the 17th of April, they found a barely legible entry that read 2 p.m, blue coat. It was obvious, however, that the original entry had been scrawled out. Later, photographers from the Garda Technical Bureau were able to uncover the original line that clearly read 8 p.m, black coat, but without an actual name. It was still not enough to place Mamie under arrest. Mamie must have felt relieved. Surely she had done enough to cover her tracks, and just like last time, she thought, the scandal would eventually blow over. This time, however, she had made a terrible mistake. Gardaí had received a copy of the letter in which she threatened to kill her landlord. This was just an excuse they needed, and they returned to Hume Street with the intention of placing Mamie Cadden under arrest. The detectives questioned her again and insinuated that somebody had seen Helen enter the flat, but Mamie was unshakable, and she denied ever meeting Helen before.
I never saw her face before. I passed a remark when I saw her photograph in the newspaper to a man who was here, that she had the mouth of a prostitute.
Mamie was known to be quite derogatory when she spoke of her female clients, often calling them whores. Outside the house, crowds of curious onlookers jeered as detectives escorted Mamie to a waiting car, and newspaper photographers snapped the photographs they had been so anxiously waiting for. Mamie made her return to Mountjoy, the prison she had already spent 6 years of her life in. She would never see her little flat on Hume Street again, and soon was formally charged with the murder of Helen O'Reilly. Mamie was to be tried for murder, and if found guilty, she could be sentenced to death by hanging. The charge of murder likely came as a surprise to Mamie. She certainly never intended for any of her clients to die, but the law at the time stated clearly that if a woman should die during an illegal operation, the person who carried it out should be tried as if they had stabbed the victim in the heart themselves. The trial of Nurse Cadden began in the Criminal Court of Justice on the 22nd of October 1956 and would take a full 10 days to reach its completion, as the volumes of evidence collected by Gardaí were produced and multiple witnesses examined. The evidence against Mamie was still entirely circumstantial, so the prosecution would have to prove to the court that there simply was no other explanation for Helen's death, and they would need to do everything they could to convince the court that Helen had been inside number 17. In addition to the drag marks on the footpath, Gardaí had also found a mark on the lino in the hallway of number 17, and on the stairs and the carpet of the landing outside Mamie's flat, smears of blood had been identified. Hairs were discovered in the hallway that seemed to be similar to those of Helen O'Reilly, but of course, in 1956, there was no way to definitively prove this. Samples of Mamie's hair had been collected from a comb in the flat, and when inspected closely, the roots of the hair were found to be grey, while the rest was dyed blonde. The hairs that had been found on Helen's black coat also happened to be dyed blonde with grey roots, while on a red dressing gown belonging to Mamie Cadden were found several strands of brown hair, just like Helen O'Reilly's. Mamie had originally told the Gardaí that she had been alone in her flat all night, but witnesses testified that a man had called to the front door of number 17 at the unusually late hour of 10:25 p.m, and that they had spoken with each other for nearly an hour. Mamie refused to identify this man by name, stating that she had been treating him for hair problems. She could hardly have done this on the doorstep of the house, however. The defence argued that there was no way Mamie, in her current state of poor health, could have dragged a body down the stairs and along the street. But this begs the question, did she have a helper that night? And was the mystery man none other than Standish O'Grady, who had called to the house to assist his friend? Standish was called as a witness at the trial, and he denied that he knew or had ever met Mamie Cadden before. Milkman Patrick Rigney told the court of how when he glanced down Hume Street from St. Stephen's Green, he had seen a woman crouching over a pile of clothes, and how the light had glinted on her spectacles. When he heard a noise from the basement and he looked over the railings, he had seen a woman pressed up against the wall and looking back up at him. She had puffed fair hair and glasses, he told the court. It seemed as though Rigney was about to identify Mamie as the woman he had seen that morning, but he was prevented from doing so, as this information had not been shared with the defence. However, the damage had already been done, as when the jury looked to the dock, they saw for themselves how closely Mamie resembled the description. Mrs. Farrelly, who had heard the dragging noises early in the morning, also gave evidence that she had heard women's voices coming from the flat when Mamie was supposed to have been alone in bed. The most damning evidence in the trial came from Garda Horgan, a photographer at the Technical Bureau, who had taken detailed photographs of Mamie's diary and the scribbled out entry for the 17th of April. He had been able to uncover the original entry for that evening that clearly read 8 p.m, black coat. Mamie had been caught out attempting to cover her tracks. While Helen's name was not in the diary, it was obvious that it was her black coat Mamie was referring to. By the end of the trial, there was little doubt in the mind of the jury that Mamie Cadden was responsible for Helen's death. When they finally withdrew, their deliberation took less than an hour, and on their return to court, they declared that Mary Anne Cadden was guilty of murder. Mamie was not shaken by the verdict, and remained as belligerent as always. When asked by the judge if there was any reason she should not be sentenced to death, she replied,
"You will never do it. This is not my country. I am reporting this to the President of my country. This is the third time I am convicted in this country falsely, and I will report it, and I will see about it at a later date. Only for my counsel I would say something you would not like to hear."
Mamie Cadden was sentenced to be hanged on the 27th of November 1956, to which she responded,
"Well, I am not a Catholic. Take that now."
When Mamie told the court, "You will never do it," she was correct. Following a failed appeal, a petition of clemency was lodged with the government by her solicitor in January 1957, and her sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. The first year of imprisonment in Mountjoy took its toll on Mamie, and in 1958 she was declared to be insane and was moved to the Central Criminal Mental Hospital in Dundrum. Her time in Dundrum was to be even shorter, as on the 20th of April 1959, Mary Anne Cadden suffered a heart attack and died. She was buried in a mass grave belonging to the Central Mental Hospital in Deansgrange Cemetery. As Mamie Cadden's death sentence was read out in court, sobbing could be heard from a group of women in the public gallery, while outside the door of the courtroom, cries of "Hanger, hanger" could be heard from the crowd. Mamie was a complex and divisive figure. Many viewed her as an evil murderess, while others, including some of the hundreds of women she successfully operated on, were far more sympathetic to her plight. Throughout her career, her primary motivation was profit, rather than a drive to help other women who found themselves in difficult situations, and sometimes the welfare of those who entrusted themselves or their children to her care was not the priority it should have been. It is probably fair to say, however, that there was never any intent on her behalf to kill or injure her patients. Do you think it was fair that she was tried for murder, or would a charge of manslaughter have been more appropriate? Let me know what you think in the comments section below.